Alina Vasquez was eating cold noodles in her small apartment on Earth when the message arrived. The holographic seal that appeared above her kitchen table was one she had never seen before. It showed a circle of stars surrounding a single eye, the symbol of the Galactic Assembly. She dropped her fork. In 12 years since humanity had made first contact with alien life, no human had ever received a direct message from the Assembly. Humans were a probationary species. They were allowed to exist in galactic society, but they were not allowed to participate. They could watch. They could learn. They could not speak. The message was simple. It contained coordinates, a time, and 3 words: your presence requested. 6 hours later, Alina stood on the bridge of a Merchant Guild transport ship, watching Earth shrink to a blue dot behind her. She was 43 years old. She had spent 20 years as a diplomat, first for the United Nations, then for the newly formed Earth Council. She had negotiated peace between nations that had hated each other for centuries. She had talked warlords into laying down their weapons. She had never felt as small as she did now. The transport ship jumped through folded space, and Alina's stomach turned inside out. When she opened her eyes, she saw Nexus Prime through the viewport. It was a station the size of a small moon, built from metals that gleamed like liquid silver. Ships from 100 different species moved around it like insects around a hive. A docking tube connected to the transport, and Alina walked through it alone. No guards, no assistants, no other humans. Just her and the cold, recycled air of an alien station. A floating drone met her at the end of the tube. It scanned her with a blue light and spoke in perfect English. "Ambassador Vasquez, you will follow this unit to the assembly chamber. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not interfere. These are the conditions of your invitation." Lena nodded. She had expected nothing less. The assembly chamber was a vast, circular room with seats, rising in tiers toward a ceiling that showed the stars outside. Hundreds of alien species filled those seats. Alina saw beings made of light, beings made of stone, beings that looked like insects, and beings that looked like gods. She was guided to a small platform near the bottom of the chamber. Far from the center, where the important decisions happened, in that center stood 2 groups facing each. They're like armies before a battle. On one side were the Kethari. They were tall, reptilian creatures with scales that shifted color based on their emotions. Right now, those scales were deep red, the color of anger, the color of war. Their leader was a massive creature called the War Speaker, and his teeth were bared in a permanent snarl. On the other side were the Vorath. They were crystalline beings that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. They had no faces that Alina could read, but their edges were sharp, and they stood perfectly still. Their leader was called the High Logician, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Between the 2 groups floated a sphere of pure light. This was the Arbiter, an artificial intelligence that had moderated assembly disputes for 50,000 years. It had seen empires rise and fall. It had watched species go extinct. And now it watched the Kethari and the Vorath with what Alina could only describe as exhaustion. "The situation remains unchanged," the Arbiter announced. Its voice filled the chamber without echoing. "Both fleets hold position at the Helian boundary. Neither side will withdraw. Neither side will negotiate." The War Speaker stepped forward. "There is nothing to negotiate. The Vorath have insulted our honor for 3,000 years. The dying star belongs to the Kethari by right of blood." The High Logician responded without moving. "Emotional claims have no mathematical value. The star's isotopes should be allocated based on population efficiency. The Vorath collective requires more energy. The logical distribution favors us." "Logic," the War Speaker spat the word like poison. "You hide behind logic like cowards hide behind walls. Cowardice is an emotional concept. It has no bearing on resource allocation." Lena watched this exchange and felt a chill run down her spine. These were not politicians posturing for advantage. These were 2 species that genuinely could not understand each other. They were speaking different languages, even though the translation systems made their words identical. The Arbiter turned slowly, addressing the entire assembly. If war begins at the Hellion boundary, projections indicate 14 billion casualties within the first 72 hours. Both civilizations will be crippled. Neither will achieve their objectives. This outcome benefits no one. A murmur ran through the chamber, but no one stood to speak. Alina looked around at the ancient species in their seats. Some of them had existed for millions of years. Some of them had technology that could reshape planets. And none of them knew what to do. She understood why. The Cathari and the Varath had been enemies for 3,000 years. Every species in the assembly had tried to mediate at some point. Every attempt had failed. The hatred ran too deep. The misunderstanding was too complete. But as Alina watched the two delegations glare at each other, she noticed something strange. The war speaker's scales kept flickering. Not with anger, but with something else. A color she had seen before in human faces. The Vorath High Logician's crystalline body was vibrating at a frequency that seemed wrong for a being of pure logic. Both of them were afraid, not of each other. Alina was certain of that. They had faced each other for 3 millennia. They knew exactly what the other could do. This was a different kind of fear. The kind that came from standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you could not stop yourself from jumping. They did not want this war, but they did not know how to stop it. Alina pulled out her personal communicator and typed a message to Earth. She marked it highest priority. She addressed it to everyone she knew, in every archive, every university, every museum, every library. Send me everything, she wrote. Human history, human art, human games, human wars, human peace treaties. Every story we have ever told about enemies becoming friends, every record of hate becoming understanding, all of it. Now, the responses began arriving within minutes. Terabytes of data flooding into her device. The collected memory of a species that had spent 200,000 years learning how to hurt each other, how to heal. Alina looked up at the two ancient civilizations preparing to destroy each other, and she felt something she had not expected. Hope, because she had seen this before. Not on this scale. Not with aliens, but she had seen two sides so locked in hatred that they had forgotten why they were fighting. She had seen enemies who wanted peace but did not know how to ask for it. Humans were the youngest species in the galaxy, the most primitive, the most violent. They had killed each other in numbers. That would shame the Cathari and confuse the Vorath, but they had also learned something. That neither of these ancient civilizations seemed to know. Sometimes the only way to end a war was to understand why it started, and Alina was very, very good at asking the right questions. Alina did not sleep that night. She sat in the small room the assembly had given her, surrounded by floating screens of data. Her eyes burned. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. But she could not stop reading. The information from Earth filled her room like a digital storm. Thousands of years of human conflict scrolled past her eyes. Wars fought over land. Wars fought over religion. Wars fought over insults that happened so long ago that no one remembered the original offense. But Alina was not looking for patterns in human history. She was looking for patterns in alien history, and she was finding them. The Cathari Dominion kept detailed records. They were a proud species, and they documented everything. Every battle, every victory, every defeat. Alina read through 3,000 years of their conflict with the Vorath. Something did not add up. The current fight was about the dying star at the Hellion boundary. Its rare isotopes could power either civilization for generations. That was the official reason for the war: resources, survival, logic. But the Cathari records told a different story. Alina found it buried in the historical archive that had been translated into 100 languages but never properly analyzed. It was the story of a colony ship called the Bright Dawn, 1,000 years before the current crisis. The Bright Dawn had carried 17,000 Cathari settlers toward a new home. Families, children, elders, the future of an entire bloodline. But the ship's navigation systems failed. and it crashed on a barren mining world at the edge of Voroth space. The survivors sent distress signals. They begged for help. They were running out of air, out of water, out of hope. The Voroth received their signals. They calculated the resources required for a rescue mission. They determined that the cost exceeded the benefit. The settlers were not Voroth citizens. Their survival provided no advantage to the collective. So the Voroth did nothing. 17,000 Cathari died on that frozen world. Among them was the grandson of the Dominion Emperor, the only heir to a bloodline that had ruled for 10,000 years. Alina leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Now she understood. The war was not about resources. It had never been about resources. It was about grief. It was about a wound that had never healed because no one had ever acknowledged it existed.
She pulled up the Voroth records next. Their archives were different. No stories. No emotions. Just data. Numbers and calculations stretching back millions of years. Elena searched for any mention of the Bright Dawn. Incident. She found it listed under Resource Allocation Decision. 7,442,891. Single paragraph describing the mathematical reasoning behind the decision not to rescue the Cathari settlers. The paragraph ended with the words, outcome, optimal. Elena felt sick. The Voroth had let 17,000 people die and called it optimal. But as she read more of their records, she began to understand something else. The Voroth did not think the way humans did. They did not think the way the Cathari did. They were beings of pure logic, and in their framework, emotions were errors. Grief was a malfunction. Guilt was illogical. They had never apologized for the Bright Dawn because they did not understand that an apology was needed. To them, the decision had been correct. The math was sound. Why would anyone be upset about correct math? And the Cathari had never explained their grief, because doing so would require admitting vulnerability to the species that had caused their pain. In Cathari culture, showing weakness to an enemy was worse than death. It was dishonor that stained generations. Elena stood up and walked to the window of her room. Outside, the stars burned cold and distant. Somewhere out there, two fleets waited to destroy each other. 14 billion lives hung in the balance. And the whole thing was based on a misunderstanding that had festered for 1,000 years. The Cathari were waiting for the Voroth to apologize. But the Voroth did not know they had done anything wrong. The Voroth were confused by Cathari hostility. But they had never asked why, because asking why would require acknowledging that. Emotions mattered. It was like watching two people scream at each other in different languages. Each one certain the other was being deliberately cruel. Elena thought about human history. She thought about the feuds that had lasted generations. The hatreds passed from parent to child like poisoned inheritances. She thought about how many wars had been fought because someone was too proud to explain their pain and someone else was too blind to see it. Humans had spent 200,000 years making this exact mistake. They had killed millions of their own kind over misunderstandings, just like this one. But humans had also learned, slowly, painfully, through blood and fire and tears. They had learned that some wounds could not heal until they were acknowledged. They had learned that some enemies could become friends if someone just took the time to translate. Elena returned to her screens. She worked through the rest of the night, building a case. She cross-referenced Cathari emotional records with Voroth logical archives. She mapped the escalation of hostility over 3,000 years and traced every increase back to the same source. The Bright Dawn. Always the Bright Dawn. Every time the Cathari thought about making peace, they remembered 17,000 dead settlers in an empire that called their deaths optimal. Every time the Voroth tried to understand Cathari aggression, They ran calculations that showed no logical reason for it and concluded that the Cathari were simply irrational. Neither side could see the truth. The Cathari were not irrational. The Vorath were not cruel. They were just broken in different ways, and neither one had the tools to fix the other. But humans did. Humans had spent their entire existence breaking and fixing and breaking again. They had invented concepts like closure and reconciliation and truth and justice. Commissions. They had built monuments to their enemies and held hands with the children of those who had killed their grandparents. It was messy. It was imperfect. It often failed, but sometimes it worked. And when it worked, it could heal wounds that logic alone could never touch. As the artificial sun of Nexus Prime began to brighten outside her window, Elena made her decision. She would ask to speak to the assembly. She knew they would refuse. Probationary species had no voice. But she would ask anyway, because she finally understood what neither the Cathari nor the Vorath could see. This was not a conflict that could be solved with military strength or logical arguments. This was a conflict that needed a translator, and after 200,000 years of translating between enemies, humans were very good at that job. Elena straightened her clothes, took a deep breath, and walked out of her room toward the assembly chamber. She had 9 minutes to save 14 billion lives. She just had to convince them to listen. The assembly chamber was louder than the day before. Elena could hear the arguments before she even entered the room. The Cathari were roaring. The Vorath were humming at frequencies that made her teeth ache. The other species in the galleries were shouting their own opinions, and the Arbiter's light was flashing in patterns that seemed almost frustrated. Elena walked to her small platform near the edge of the chamber and stood there quietly. No one noticed her. No one cared about the human observer in the corner. She was a footnote, a curiosity, a primitive creature allowed to watch her betters fail. She raised her hand. Nothing happened. The arguments continued. The war speaker was describing in great detail what he would do to Vorath territory once the war began. The high logician was calculating casualty projections with cold precision. Elena raised her hand higher. The floating drone that had guided her the day before appeared at her side. Ambassador Vasquez, you are not permitted to address the assembly. Probationary species do not have speaking rights. I understand, Elena said. Her voice was calm. But I am invoking amicus curiae. The drone paused. Its lights flickered. That term is not in my database. It is a human legal concept, Elena explained. It means friend of the court. In human legal systems, when two parties are unable to resolve a dispute, an outside voice can offer perspective, not as a participant, but as an assistant to the process. The drone was silent for a long moment. Then it floated toward the Arbiter and transmitted Elena's request. The chamber fell quiet. Every eye, every sensor, every form of perception turned toward the glowing sphere at the center of the room. The Arbiter spoke. The human ambassador has invoked a concept from her species' legal traditions. Amicus curiae, a friend of the court. The ancient AI paused. This concept does not exist in assembly protocols. However, assembly protocols have failed to resolve this dispute for 3,000 years. Murmurs rippled through the galleries. I will allow the human to speak, the Arbiter continued. She will have 9 minutes. If her words provide no value, she will be removed, and humanity's probationary status will be reviewed. Elena felt her heart pounding in her chest. 9 minutes. That was all she had. 9 minutes to undo 3,000 years of hatred. She walked to the center of the chamber. The war speaker towered over her, his scales dark with suspicion. The high logician watched her with crystalline eyes that reflected nothing. Elena did not start with facts. She did not start with arguments. She started with a story. 200 years ago, she said, humans dropped a weapon on a city called Hiroshima. In a single flash of light, 80,000 people died. Men, women, children. They were vaporized in an instant. Their shadows were burned into the walls. The chamber was silent. Even the Cathari stopped growling. The nation that dropped that bomb and the nation that suffered it had been enemies. They had killed each other by the millions. They had committed acts of cruelty that still haunt our history books. When the war ended, everyone expected the hatred to last forever. Elena paused and looked at the war speaker. It did not last forever. 50 years after the bomb, citizens of both nations stood together at a memorial built on the ruins of Hiroshima. They held hands. They wept together. They did not forget what had happened, but they chose to build something new from the ashes. The war speaker's scales flickered with colors Elena could not name. He said nothing. Elena turned to the High Logician. I have read your records. I know what happened to the Bright Dawn. The chamber went completely still. Several of the older species leaned forward in their seats. The Bright Dawn, a name that had not been spoken in assembly chambers for centuries. 17,000 Cathari died on a frozen world, Elena continued. They sent distress signals. They begged for help. And the Vorath Collective calculated that rescue was not efficient and did nothing. The High Logician's crystalline form vibrated. That decision was mathematically optimal. Resource allocation was incomplete, Elena interrupted. She had never interrupted an alien before. She had been told it was deeply disrespectful. She did not care. Your calculation was missing a variable. The High Logician stopped vibrating. In Vorath culture, the suggestion that a calculation was incomplete was almost as serious as an accusation of murder. Explain, it said. Elena took a deep breath. The Cathare do not process loss the way you do. In your framework, death is an end state. Resources stop being consumed. The equation closes. But for the Cathari, grief does not close. It compounds. It passes from generation to generation. It grows larger with time, not smaller. She turned to the war speaker. Every Cathari child born in the last 1,000 years has been taught about the Bright Dawn. Every one of them carries that grief. The debt is not 17,000 lives. The debt is 17,000 lives multiplied by 1,000 years of sorrow.
The war speaker's throat sac inflated. His claws scraped against the floor, but he did not attack. He was listening. Elena faced the High Logician again. Your optimal outcome created an infinite recursive debt in Cathari cultural mathematics. You were solving the wrong equation. You've been solving the wrong equation for 3,000 years. The Vorath delegation began to hum at frequencies that made the floor shake. They were not angry. They were calculating, running the numbers again with the new variable. And you, Elena said to the war speaker, have been waiting for them to apologize for a crime they did not know they committed. You have been asking the blind to describe color. That is not honor. That is not justice. That is just pain looking for a target. The war speaker's scales turned to color Elena had never seen before. Something between red and purple. Something raw. You say they did not know? His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. How could they not know? We screamed our grief across the stars. Because they cannot hear it, Elena said gently. Their minds do not work that way. They heard your words, but they could not understand the meaning. You needed a translator. Someone who could speak both languages. She stepped back and looked at both delegations. Humans are the youngest species in this galaxy. We have no ancient wisdom. We have no superior technology. We have nothing to offer except this. We have spent 200,000 years hurting each other over misunderstandings exactly like this one. We have learned through blood and fire how to translate between enemies. Lena straightened her spine and spoke her final words. You do not have to trust each other. You do not have to love each other. You just have to understand that you are both incomplete. And now that you know the full equation, you can choose to solve it differently. The chamber was silent. Alina had used all 9 minutes. Now she could only wait to see. If anyone had listened, the silence lasted for exactly 12 seconds. Alina counted every one of them. Then the chamber exploded. A species that looked like floating jellyfish began pulsing with angry light. The human oversteps. She has no authority here. A delegation of insectoid creatures clicked their mandibles in agreement. Probationary species should be removed. This is unprecedented interference. The Arbiter's light flickered rapidly, trying to restore order, but the damage was done. Alina had broken 3,000 years of diplomatic protocol. And half the assembly wanted her head for it, but not everyone was shouting. The Cathari war speaker stood frozen in place. His scales were shifting through colors so fast that Alina could not track them. He was thinking processing. For the first time in perhaps 1,000 years, he was considering the possibility that his enemy was not evil, just different. The Voroth High Logician had stopped humming. Its crystalline form was perfectly still, which Alina had learned meant deep calculation. It was rebuilding equations, adding the variables she had given it, running the numbers again and again. A tall being with silver skin stepped forward from the upper galleries. Alina recognized it as a representative of the Helix Consortium, one of the oldest species in the assembly. Its voice was like wind through dead leaves. The human has spoken out of turn, it said, but she has also spoken truth. I have observed this conflict for 2,000 years. I've never heard anyone name the Bright Dawn in this chamber. It was considered too dangerous, too raw. The silver being tilted its head. Perhaps that was our mistake. More murmurs. Some angry, some thoughtful. Alina stepped forward again. She had not been given permission to speak, but she was already in trouble. A little more could not hurt. I have a proposal, she said. It will not solve everything. It will not erase 3,000 years, but it might give both sides a reason to stop. The Arbiter's light pulsed. You have already exceeded your time, Ambassador. Then remove me, Alina said. But let me finish first. The ancient AI was silent for a moment. Then, incredibly, it dimmed its light slightly. A gesture of permission. Alina pulled out a small data chip and pressed it. A holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a space station unlike anything the assembly had ever seen. It was built from 2 different architectural styles woven together. Sharp Voroth crystals merged with curved Cathari stonework. In the center was an open chamber filled with light. This is my proposal, Alina said. A joint memorial station, built at the exact coordinates where the Bright Dawn crashed. Cathari design. Vorath engineering. A place where the dead are remembered and the living can meet. The war speaker's scales flickered. You want us to build something with them? Yes. After what they did? 'Cause of what they did. Alina turned to face him fully. You have been waiting for acknowledgement. You have been waiting for the Voroth to see your pain. A monument built with their own hands is that acknowledgement. Every crystal they shape, every calculation they run, will be proof that they finally understand. The High Logician spoke. And what do we gain from this construction? Alina had expected this question. Completion, she said. Your equation was wrong. That is not a matter of opinion in your framework. It is simply incorrect. Building this memorial corrects the equation. It closes the loop. For a species that values logical consistency, that should matter. The Voroth hummed softly. The answer was not perfect for them, but it was also not nothing. There is more, Alina continued. She manipulated the hologram, showing the dying star at the Hellion boundary. The memorial station will have a joint council, Cathari and Voroth, working together. That council will determine how the star's isotopes are distributed, not based on population, not based on power, based on agreement. This is inefficient, the High Logician said. Extremely, Alina agreed. But efficiency is what brought you here. 3,000 years of optimal decisions, and you are standing on the edge of a war that will kill billions. Perhaps it is time to try something inefficient, a war speaker laughed. It was a harsh sound, like rocks grinding together, but it was a laugh. The human has teeth, he said. I did not expect that, Alina pressed on. If either side betrays this agreement, they lose the memorial. For the Cathari, that means losing. The only acknowledgement of their grief they have ever received. For the Vorith, that means accepting permanent, logical inconsistency. The cost of betrayal exceeds the cost of cooperation. She looked around the chamber at the hundreds of species watching her. Some were hostile, some were curious. Some seemed almost impressed. Humans call this having skin in the game, she said. When both sides have something to lose, both sides have a reason to make it work. It is not elegant. It is not pure. It is messy and complicated and very, very human. She paused, but it might just work. The chamber fell into a different kind of silence, not hostile, thoughtful. The Helix Consortium representative spoke again. This proposal requires both parties to agree. The human cannot force acceptance. No, Alina said. I cannot. I can only show them a door. They have to choose to walk through it. She turned to the war speaker. You have carried this grief for 1,000 years. Your people have passed it down like a sacred wound. But wounds that never heal eventually kill the body. Is that what you want, to bleed forever? The war speaker's scales settled into a deep blue, the color of sorrow, the color of exhaustion. We did not want this war, he said quietly. We never wanted this war. But we did not know how to stop without losing our honor. This is how, Alina said. You stop by being acknowledged. Stop by having a place where your dead are remembered by the ones who let them die. That is not weakness. That is victory. She turned to the High Logician. And you, your species values logic above all else. But logic without complete data is just guessing with extra steps. You have been guessing for 3,000 years. This proposal gives you the chance to finally get the equation right. The Vorath delegation hummed among themselves. Alina could not understand their frequency-based language, but she could see them calculating, weighing variables, testing outcomes. Finally, the High Logician spoke. The proposal has merit. It requires further analysis. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. The war speaker looked at his enemy. For the first time in perhaps 1,000 years, he did not look at the Vorath with pure hatred. There was something else in his eyes, something that might have been hope. Further analysis, he repeated slowly. Yes, we would agree to that. Alina let out a breath. She did not know she had been holding. It was not over, not even close. For the first time in 3,000 years, both sides were willing to talk about something other than war, and that was enough for now. The negotiations lasted 47 hours. Alina did not sleep. She did not eat. She stood in the corner of a small conference room while the Ketheri and Vorath delegations argued over every detail of the memorial proposal. The shape of the station, the materials used, the exact wording of the dedication plaque. Everything was a battle, but it was a different kind of battle. They were not fighting to destroy each other. They were fighting to build something together. And that made all the difference. The war speaker wanted the memorial to face the star where his ancestors had died. The High Logician calculated that this orientation would reduce energy efficiency by 12%. They argued about it for 6 hours. Alina finally stepped in. Face the station toward the star, she said, but use Vorath crystal arrays to capture the lost energy and redirect it. You lose nothing, and the dead are honored. Both delegations stared at her. Then the High Logician hummed softly. The human solution is ... acceptable. It will suffice. And so it went, hour after hour, compromise after compromise. Alina became the translator between two languages that had never spoken to each other. When the Cathari said honor, she explained what they meant in logical terms. When the Vorith said efficiency, she found the emotional equivalent. It was exhausting. It was frustrating. Several times, both delegations stormed out of the room and refused to return. Each time, Alina brought them back with patience and persistence and the occasional reminder that 14 billion lives were still waiting for their decision at hour 42. Something changed. The High Logician had been explaining a technical specification about the memorial's power systems when it stopped mid-sentence. Its crystalline form vibrated in a way Alina had never seen before. "I have been running calculations," it said. "Continuous calculations since the human first spoke. I have added the variable she provided, the concept of compounding grief, recursive emotional debt." The war speaker leaned forward, and the numbers suggest that our original decision regarding the bright dawn was ... incorrect. The Vorith's voice was strange, almost soft. "We did not have complete data. Our equation was flawed. The outcome was not optimal." The conference room went silent. Alina held her breath. This was the moment. The Vorath could not apologize in the human sense. They did not understand guilt or remorse, but they did understand error. And for a species built on logic, admitting error was the most profound statement possible. The war speaker rose slowly from his seat. His scales shifted through colors that Alina could not name. Deep blues and purples, and a shimmering gold that seemed to pulse with light. "Say that again," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. The High Logician turned to face him directly. "Our decision regarding your colony ship was based on incomplete data. The equation was flawed. We have recalculated. The debt is ... acknowledged." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the war speaker did something that had not happened in 3,000 years of Cathari-Vorath relations. He bowed his head. "The blood debt," he said slowly, carefully, "is satisfied." Alina felt tears running down her face. She did not wipe them away. The agreement was signed 2 hours later. The joint memorial station would be built at the coordinates of the Bright Dawn crash. Both species would contribute equally. The dying star's resources would be managed by a joint council. And for the first time in 30 centuries, the Cathari and Vorath would work together instead of preparing to die together. Word spread through Nexus Prime like fire. The armadas at the Hellion boundary received simultaneous stand-down orders. 14 billion lives that had been hours from destruction suddenly had futures again. The assembly chamber erupted in sounds that Alina could not understand, but recognized as celebration. She found a quiet corner and sat down. Her legs were shaken. Her hands would not stop trembling. She had not fully understood what she was doing until it was done. She had walked into a room full of ancient civilizations and convinced them to end a war that was older than human agriculture. The Arbiter found her there an hour later. The ancient AI floated before her, its light, gentle and warm. "Ambassador Vasquez," it said. "The Assembly will vote on humanity's probationary status tomorrow." Lena looked up. "I expected that. We broke a lot of rules today, you did?" The Arbiter paused. "I have moderated this assembly for 50,000 years. I have watched species rise to greatness and fall to dust. I have seen every form of diplomacy that intelligent life has invented." Alina waited. "I have never seen anything like what you did today," the Arbiter continued. "You did not argue. You did not threaten. You did not offer bribes or make deals. You simply ... translated. You took two languages that could not understand each other and found the words that both could hear." "It is what humans do," Alina said quietly. "We have had a lot of practice." "Yes." The Arbiter's light pulsed. "Your species has spent its existence hurting itself. Your history is full of blood and fire and senseless cruelty. Many in the Assembly believe this makes humanity dangerous. It's primitive, unworthy of full membership." Alina felt her heart sink. "They are wrong," the Arbiter said. "Your suffering has given you something that no other species possesses. You understand pain in a way that even the ancient races do not. And more importantly, you understand how to heal it." The AI moved closer, its light warming Elena's face. "I will recommend full membership for humanity, not because you are powerful, not because you are advanced, but because the galaxy needs translators. It needs beings who can look at enemies and see the pain behind the hatred. It needs the perspective that only comes from surviving the worst of yourselves." Alina did not know what to say. She had come to Nexus Prime expecting to be ignored. She had spoken, expecting to be silenced. She had proposed a solution, expecting to fail. Instead, she had changed everything. "Thank you," she finally managed. Do not thank me, the Arbiter replied. Thank the 17,000 Cathari who died on a frozen world 1,000 years ago. Thank the billions of humans who killed each other so that you could learn how to stop. Thank every being who ever suffered so that suffering could one day end. The AI began to float away, then paused. One more thing, yes? The memorial station will need a name. Both delegations have agreed that the human who proposed it should choose. Alina thought for a long moment. She thought about the bright dawn and its doomed passengers. She thought about Hiroshima and the shadows burned into walls. She thought about every human who had ever looked at an enemy and chosen to see a person instead. Call it the bridge, she said, because that is what it is. A way to cross the distance between worlds. The Arbiter's light pulsed once more. The bridge. It is appropriate. Then Alina was alone with the stars and the silence and the weight of what she had done. Somewhere out there, two ancient civilizations were learning to speak to each other for the first time. Somewhere out there, 14 billion lives continued because one human had asked the right questions. She closed her eyes and smiled. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy. And perhaps for the first time, the galaxy was no longer alone either. They had found their translators, and the war had ended before it ever began.